This is a brief video discussion in accounting for not-for-profit organizations. Okay, so when we hear not-for-profit organizations, we would directly think of these five major organizations or group of organizations. Okay, una, we can associate a not-for-profit organizations to a central government departments and agencies, local government departments, publicly funded healthcare and social housing bodies. It could also be a public higher education institutions. And finally, it may be charitable bodies. Basically, a not-for-profit organizations, it could be a private not-for-profit organizations or a public not-for-profit organizations. Yan. For a public not-for-profit organizations, yun yung mga NPOs or NPE na mayroong governmental functions. Just like yung apat na to, so they are not-for-profit organizations with governmental functions. The other one naman is those charitable bodies. Okay, so yun yung not-for-profit organization or a type of an NPO that lack governmental functions. Well, in this discussion, I will focus on an NPO such as charitable bodies. Ayan. So let's define what is a non-profit organizations. It is one that carries out some socially desirable needs of the community or its members and whose activities are not directed towards making profit. Okay, so the very major uh, difference of a not-for-profit organization sa mga for-profit organizations is of course, sa ating non-profit organizations, it is not directed towards making profit, unlike business enterprises. So the creation of an NPO is mainly for social desires, or for some social goals. So what are the characteristics ba of a not-for-profit entities? Una, it receives contributions of significant amount from resources providers who do not expect commensurate or proportionary pecuniary return. So for business enterprises or yung mga profit oriented enterprises, syempre yung contributions nila is sa owners, from owners or from the owners. Okay? Pero syempre yung mga owners, yung mga contributions nila or investment, they are expecting a return, a return on their investment. While in a not-for-profit entities, yung mga contributions, yan, kumbaga this is the counterpart of the investment in a profit oriented entities. The counterpart for the investment is ating not-for-profit entities would be the contributions from resource providers, and remember it includes significant amount. However, these resource providers, they do not expect return on their investment or a commensurate or proportionary pecuniary return. So this is also the reason why yung ating mga not-for-profit entities, particularly sa ating statement of financial position, hindi tayo gumagamit ng owner's equity kasi it lacks, or not-for-profit entities, it somehow lacks ownership or the sense of ownership. Dahil yung mga nagko-contribute sa kanyang operations or nagko-contribute ng mga finances, cash or non-cash, for the operation of the entity or of the not-for-profit entity, is that hindi sila or they do not after the return or any return for their contributions. The second characteristic is that it operates for purposes other than to provide goods and services for profits. Yan. Yung ating not-for-profit entities, they provide either goods or service pa rin naman, pero they provide it to carry out their social goals. Yan. Or for which, no, or to achieve the objectives for which the entity is being organized or created. Yeah, they also provide goods or service pero hindi for profit. Unlike business enterprises na nagpo-provide ng goods and services para magka-earn ng profit. Dito, again, they provide goods and services to carry out some social goals. It does not possess ownership interest like those of business enterprises. So as what I have said kanina, dahil yung ating mga contributors or yung mga resource providers, they are not looking or they do not after a return on their contributions. Kaya it lack ownership interest or it does not possess the characteristic of being owned or having owners of the enterprise or entities. Now, dahil yung video discussion na ito is focused on private not-for-profit entities, ano-ano ba yung mga categories ng private not-for-profit entities? Una, we have colleges and universities. Ayan. So, yung mga colleges and universities natin, it belongs to or it is considered to be a not-for-profit entities. But not all, kasi meron man tayong mga state universities and colleges or yung mga SUCs natin. Okay? They are not-for-profit entities but they are not private. They are public. Ayan. And we also have healthcare entities, yung mga hospitals, ayan. And you have voluntary health and welfare organizations, and yung hindi nakasali sa tatlo, they would be or they will belong to other not-for-profit organizations such as churches and museums. Ayan. So, syempre, because this is this discussion, it will focus on, of course, how to account the transactions of a not-for-profit organizations or entities. Let's know what are the financial statements ba that are furnished by NPEs. Ayan. So it could be or it would be statement of financial position, statement of changes in net assets, the statement of cash flows, and the notes to financial statement. So ito yung mga financial statements na pino-furnish ng not-for-profit organizations or entities. Ayan. So for the statement of financial position, okay, so just like business enterprises, meron din tayo ditong assets, syempre, liabilities, and in replace for owner's equity. Okay, ginagamit sa mga NPOs are net or would be net assets. Okay? At yung net asset sa statement of financial position ng NPO, it is further classified into three. The net asset could be unrestricted, it could be a temporarily restricted, and or permanently restricted net assets. Yan. Now for the statement of activities naman and changes in net assets, okay? So ito yung kumbaga counterpart ng income statement or statement of profit or loss, okay, sa mga business enterprises. So, ano ba yung pinoprovide ng statement na ito? It reports revenues, expenses, gains, and losses during the period. Kumbaga, ito yung income statement ng mga NPO. Ayan. So, this statement is structured to present the change in each class of net assets during the period. Ayan. So, yung statement of activities and changes in net assets, one of the main goals in preparing this type of statement is mainly to present what are the changes ba in the net assets. Ayan, dito. Ayan. And ano-ano ba yung mga changes na yon, or saan ba yung mga changes na yon? Okay? Sa unrestricted net asset ba? Sa temporarily restricted, or sa permanently restricted net asset? Okay? So makikita mo yun siya sa iyong statement of activities and changes in net assets. Okay? So how much or what is the change ba of the unrestricted net assets? Okay? Due to the operation of the not-for-profit entity during the period or for the period ended. Okay? And what are the changes ba, or uh, ano ba yung balance, no, ng ating temporarily restricted net asset? Okay? So ano bang nag-cause, no, sa pag-change ng balance ng ating temporarily restricted or permanently restricted asset during the period? Ayan. So makikita mo yan siya sa statement of activities and changes in net assets. Revenues and gains and losses can be reported in each net asset class. So pwede kasi syempre yung ating mga contributions from our resource providers, okay, kahit na permanently restricted yon, it could earn an income. It could earn income, okay, a revenue, a gain or a loss. Kaya we can report revenues, gains, and losses to each net asset class kahit pa naka-temporarily restricted or permanently restricted yung resource na yon. However, expenses are only reported in unrestricted net asset class. Okay? So, dapat, if you have expenses during the period, it can only be reported in the, okay, specifically, only in the unrestricted net asset class. Ayan. And changes of this net asset class during the period must also be reported. Okay? So, dapat mag-reflect din yung mga changes, no, from or of each of these net asset class. Ayan, for the period. Okay. It reports the amount of change in net assets. Sinabi natin kanina. Not-for-profit revenues, it increases unrestricted net assets, net asset class, unless limited by donor-imposed restrictions. Okay, so yung mga revenues, mostly, it is from unrestricted net assets. Pero again, dahil meron tayong mga revenues from donor-imposed resources, yung mga restricted, and so pwede pa rin na yung mga restricted assets na yun, or restricted net assets na yun, could earn revenues. And so we can still report revenues for each class of the net asset, okay? As well as your gains and losses. But again, to reiterate, expenses is always it always decrease, no? Unrestricted net assets. Unrestricted net asset lang talaga. Ayan. Now, what if merong mga expenses, okay, na hindi naman talaga siya sa unrestricted net assets? Okay? O there are cases talaga na yung expenses ay para sa mga restricted net assets. Okay? So how can you report an expenses to the unrestricted net asset when that expenses is related to a restricted net asset? That is very illogical. Kaya, discuss natin yan later, how to treat, okay, an expenses, okay, as unrestricted net asset kahit na that expenses is related to a restricted net asset. Discuss yan later. Now, what statement of cash flows? It uses the same cash flow classification as business enterprises, except that the description of financing activities is expanded to include resources that are donor restricted for long-term purposes. Ayan. Yung ating basically, no, or technically, yung ating statement of cash flows, the same lang siya sa cash flows na pinoprovide ng mga business enterprises. Ayan. So meron pa ring operating, investing, and financing. Kaya lang, yung financing natin dito, it is expanded para mag-reflect yung mga resources, yan, provided by the donors with donor-imposed restrictions. Now, the full accrual basis of accounting is used for not-for-profit entities. So, it is full accrual basis pa rin. Yan. Siyempre, revenues are recognized when earned, regardless of when received, and expenses are recorded when incurred, regardless of when paid. Naka-full accrual basis pa rin tayo sa not-for-profit entities. And accounting standards require not-for-profit entities or organizations to provide financial statements to provide organization-wide totals of assets, liabilities, and net asset, as well as the counterpart of the income statement. That's the changes in net assets. How or what are the amounts of change sa ating net asset pa? Ayan. Now, net asset classification. So, owner's equity does not apply in NPO because individuals and organizations provide resources to these organizations without expecting a return in such investment. So, it is somehow illogical na record or mag-recognize tayo ng owner's equity sa NPO, okay? Dahil nga, as what I have said kanina, yung NPO, yung mga contributors niya, basically, yung mga contributors, yun yung magpo-provide, kumbaga, yun yung magpo-provide ng financing, no, sa non-profit organization. Okay? Kung sa business enterprises pa tayo, okay, yung mga providers ng ating finances, yan, syempre, okay, they will really look, no, or look forward for receiving a return on their investment. Okay? At dahil nga, in NPOs, yung mga nagpo-provide ng mga resources, hindi sila naglo-look forward na maka-receive ng return on their contributions. Kaya, hindi tayo magagamit dapat ng owner's equity. Okay? Instead, yung gagamitin natin is net asset. Yan. In lieu of the owner's equity. Okay? And, again, yung net asset natin, diba, it is further classified into 3. Okay? So, this is the portion, okay? If it is a permanently restricted net asset, okay? This is the portion of net asset, the use of which is limited by donor-imposed limitations that do not expire. So, hindi siya actually na-expire, kaya dapat nakakip and intact yun siya by time and cannot be removed by time or action by the entity. Ayan. So, upon the contribution, no, of the contributor, okay, of a particular resource to the NPO, kapag sinabi niya that contribution from me, dapat it should be kept intact. Okay? It should be kept intact as long as the entity exists. Ayan. So, dapat naka-intact yan talaga siya. Okay? Kapag permanently restricted yan, it will not be transferred to the other two classifications of the net asset. Ayan. Kapag permanently restricted. And some or all of the income may be used for general or specified use. Although, yung resource na yon is permanently restricted, pwede rin naman na yung income from those permanently restricted assets, if nag-earn yun ng income, yan, pwede naman yan gamitin, no, ng entity for general or specified use. Yan. Now, kapag temporarily restricted naman yung net asset, so this is limited by donor-imposed stipulation, that either expire. If it expires, then it is time restricted. Ayan. Or by fulfillment of a stipulation, and it is a purpose restriction. For example, the receipt of a college of a grant for general education. This amount received for that grant is classified as temporarily restricted until such time that the purpose for which such grant was received has been fulfilled. Okay, so sa madaling sabi, from the term itself, temporarily restricted. Okay? So dahil temporarily restricted siya, it may be classified into unrestricted net asset classification. Kapag nag-expire na yung time, okay? For example, si donor or si resource provider, sabi niya na, itong i-contribute ko, okay, sa inyo, after 5 years, yan, you are now allowed, no, to use whatever purpose you may choose, no, sa contribution ko na ito. Yan. If that's the case, then yung resources na kinontribute niya is time, meron siyang time restriction. Pag nag-expire na yung time, no, na stipulate ng donor, then pwede na siya ma-transfer from temporarily restricted to unrestricted net asset. Or pwede din na yung stipulation niya is based on purpose. Ayan. So, mag-stipulate si donor or si contributor ng particular purpose, no, of the fund being contributed. Pag na-meet niyo na yung purpose na yun, then only such time na pwede ma-transfer yung resources na yun from temporarily restricted to unrestricted net asset classification. Just like with this example. Unexpected to be reclassified upon lapse of time, kapag may time restriction or a restriction or fulfillment of a stipulation. Kapag mayroong purpose restriction. So the next net asset classification is the unrestricted net asset. So this is a portion of the net asset with no donor imposed stipulation. So very simple. So ito yung mga resources na pinrovide ng resource provider na walang kaakibat restriction or stipulation. So yung entity, okay, or the not-for-profit entity, meron siyang total discretion, okay, for unrestricted net asset. Kung ano ba yung gusto niyang gawin doon. Ayan. Now, so before a resource may be classified as restricted, restrictions must be imposed by donor from outside the organization before an asset be classified as restricted. So magiging restricted lang, either temporarily or permanently restricted, yung isang asset, ang isang resource, kapag ang restriction is imposed, no, by someone outside the entity or the organization. So if yung nag-provide ng restriction na yon is the donor outside the organization, then only then can the resource being provided be considered or classified as a restricted net asset. And thus, assets with restrictions imposed by the Board of Trustees or internal restrictions continue to be classified as unrestricted. Kaya dahil magiging restricted lang daw yung contributed resources kapag yung nagbigay ng restriction is is from outside the organization. So yung mga assets na ang restrictions are provided or imposed by the Board of Trustees or by the people within the organization would still continue to be classified as unrestricted net asset. Ayan. So reclassification, so paano ba or kailan ba ma-reclassify yung temporarily restricted net asset to unrestricted net asset? Okay? So expenses relating to a restricted net asset class are still recorded as change in unrestricted net asset. Ito yung sinabi ko kanina na what if merong mga expenses na related siya sa mga restricted assets. Okay? So, kailangan ba talaga natin siyang i-classify or as a decrease, no, sa unrestricted net asset? Yes. Okay? Provided that there is a reclassification being made to the stated or related, no, temporarily restricted net asset. Ayan. So yung expenses na yon, still unrestricted net asset siya kahit it is from a restricted or yung expenses is related to a restricted net asset, provided na yung related restricted net asset is na-classify siya from temporarily restricted net asset to unrestricted net asset. Now, to illustrate, okay, a 20,000 peso contribution of restricted cash by a donor for a specified item, no, when received is recorded as debit ka ng cash, 20,000. Credit ka ng, syempre, revenue yon, temporarily restricted contributions for 20,000. Remember, it is restricted. Temporarily restricted contribution. Ito yung entry niya. Ayan. So, to continue, yung expenses of 15,000 from the 20,000 contribution are in a compliance with donor restriction are funded by the restricted resources. So, temporarily restricted net assets are released with an entry to reclassify. Yeah. So, paano ba tayo mag-classify? Remember, meron tayong expenses na 15,000 related to the donor restriction. Ayan. Kaya yung expenses natin, syempre, record tayo ng expenses. Debit expenses, credit cash for the said amount, 15,000. So, yung ating expenses dito would still be a decrease, no, from the unrestricted net asset kahit related siya sa isang temporarily restricted net asset. Ayan. Kasi, tinransfer rin naman natin yung temporarily restricted net asset classification to the unrestricted net asset classification by debiting reclassification out, temporarily restricted, okay, that's for 15,000, and by crediting reclassification in unrestricted for 15,000. See, okay, although yung expenses natin is a temporarily related to a temporarily restricted asset, still it is a reduction to the unrestricted net asset dahil kinlassify natin yung related, no, temporarily restricted net asset, okay, to the unrestricted net asset classification. Okay? So that's how you classify or you reclassify a temporarily restricted net asset to unrestricted net asset classification. Now let's talk about the transactions of not-for-profit organizations. Ano na ba yung mga klase or classifications ng transactions in a not-for-profit organizations? It could be contributions, okay, exchange transactions, it could be expenses, capital transactions, and agency transactions. Now, ano ba yung contribution? Contributions, it referred to unconditional transfer of resources to the entity in a voluntary. There is a voluntary non-reciprocal transaction. Okay? So, thus, should be recognized at fair value in the period received. Upon the receipt, no, of the contribution, then it should be recognized at its fair value. Ayan. So, dahil contribution yon, it is an unconditional transfer, pwede na si contributor or si resource provider mag-stipulate siya that it is pwede siya mag-include ng temporary restriction or a permanent restriction. Or pwede naman wala siyang i-provide or i-stipulate na any type of restriction. If such a case, then magiging unrestricted yung contribution na yun. So, unconditional promise to give cash or other non-cash asset in a future period is recognized when the unconditional promise to give is received from the donor. So, upon the receipt, no, of the unconditional promise, ayan, you will recognize that as revenue. Ayan. Particularly under temporarily or a temporary restricted contribution. So generally, such unconditional promise is classified as temporarily restricted contribution because of the time restriction. So bakit may time restriction? Ayan. Siyempre, upon the making, no, of the promise, pag nag-promise na si contributor na magko-contribute or mag-provide siya ng particular resources, kahit na unconditional yun, naka-temporarily restricted asset pa rin yun. Why? Kasi nga, magiging temporarily restricted siya kasi nga wala you will not directly receive, no, those assets at the time of the promise. Okay? So it would take some time. Okay? Kaya meron siyang time restriction. Kapag na-receive mo na yung promise niya, or kapag na-receive mo na yung uh, resources, no, na pinramis ng isang contributor, then magiging ano na siya, magiging or marireclassify na siya from a temporarily restricted net asset to a unrestricted net asset classification. So conditional promise to give is not recognized as revenue until the condition is substantially met. It's a transfer of asset with a conditional promise to contribute them shall be accounted for as a refundable advance until the conditions have been substantially met. So ito yung purpose no ng ating or ng application ng full accrual basis of accounting sa NPO. Kasi pag merong mga conditional promise, ano ba yung mga conditional promise? So yun yung marireceive mo siya, okay, at the happening of an uncertain future event. Okay? So at the time that the promise or at the time that the uncertain future event, okay, is substantially met, ayan, marireceive mo na siya, okay, only such time na matransfer mo siya or ma-recognize mo siya from a liability as a refundable advance to a revenue. Ayan. Now, what if the contribution is a service or services? Okay? So, a contribution of services are recognized only if a service received or the services received create or enhance non-financial asset. Okay? Kapag in-enhance niya yung ating mga non-financial asset. Ayan. Or if it requires specialized skills, okay, are provided by individual possessing those skills and would typically need to be purchased if not provided by donation. So, in any of the case, okay, dito mo lang, okay, i-recognize yung mga contributed services. Okay, kapag nakapag-enhance siya ng mga non-financial asset or kapag kung hindi siya kinontribute or kapag hindi siya ni-render sa NPO yung services na yun, the entity would have to purchase no, or to pay, okay, for such a services being provided, okay, as a donation. Okay, only in such cases no, na i-recognize natin yung mga contributed services. Contributions of works of arts and similar items. So an entity need not recognize contributions of works of art, okay, historical treasures, and similar assets if donated items are added to collections that meet all of the following conditions. No, hindi mo siya i-recognize yung mga contributed works of arts and similar items kapag it is held only for public exhibition, education, or research in furtherance of public service rather than for financial gain. Okay? If it is protected, kept unencumbered, and cared for, and preserved, and proceeds no, from sales of collection items are to be used to acquire other items for collections. So, pag na-meet niyo tong tatlo, yan, such works of arts and similar items, pwede na siya hindi i-recognize or hindi na siya i-recognize ng NPO. So, gifts of long-lived assets. So, acquisition of long-lived assets may be through gifts of such assets. So, kapag yung long-lived asset talaga yung actually binigay sa NPO or sa entity, or kapag yung NPO or yung entity inacquire niya yung long-lived asset na yon using the cash na binigay ng donor for that long-lived asset. Okay? So that's those are the ways that long-lived assets are being acquired by NPE. Ayan. So it is recorded as temporarily restricted asset. Yung mga asset na yon, yung long-lived asset na yon would be recorded as temporarily restricted and marireclassify lang siya to unrestricted asset over the useful life of the asset or as depreciation is recorded. Ayan. So at the time that we record depreciation, partly reclassify din tayo ng proportionate amount ng temporarily restricted asset of such long-lived asset to the unrestricted net asset classification. Or, pwede rin over the useful life of that asset. Now, exchange transactions. Okay? So, the next type of transactions in NPO. And so, an exchange transaction, these are reciprocal transfers in which each party receives and or sacrifices approximately equal value. So, kapag yung transaction is onerous, hindi siya gratuitous, then such transaction is considered to be an exchange transaction. And kapag there is a value or the value being given is of approximately the same value being received, and then that is considered to be or will be considered as an exchange transaction. And of course, these transactions are considered unrestricted. Ayan. So, example is yung mga sale of products and services. Okay. Siyempre, if you are selling a product or if you are selling something, and makaka-receive ka ng value, the sales price, and yung ibibigay mo naman in return is the value of the product being sold. Exchange transaction yan. Next is yung government grants that require specific performance by the NPO. They are exchange transactions and are accounted for as refundable deposits until earned. So, exchange transaction yun siya kasi although it is a grant, okay, from the government to the NPO, okay, but still, if it requires specific performance, yan, kapag may mga specific performance yan siya stipulated in the grant, then it would be considered to be an exchange transaction. Kasi you have to perform something to fulfill what is being provided for or stipulated in the grant. Kaya upon the receipt of the grant, magiging refundable deposit yun siya until earned, until the performance or until the entity, the NPE, substantially performs what is being provided for in the grants. But not all government grants naman are exchange transactions. May mga government grants that will be classified as an agency transactions. Kasi may mga government grants na yung mga, for example, meron silang mga financial assistance or aids, ipapadaan nila yon, okay, through the non-government organizations or not-for-profit organizations. Kumbaga magiging agent or it would just be a pass-through sa ating mga NPEs, okay, para ibigay sa mga third parties. Okay. And talking about agency transactions, okay, these are another type of transaction of NPOs. So these are transfers of resources to the NPO. Okay? So still transfer siya ng mga resources sa NPO, pero the entity has a little or no discretion over the resources and only acts as an intermediary or agent between the resource provider and the third party. So, kumbaga, intermediary lang siya or agent lang si NPO. Kumbaga, parang pass-through lang siya, okay, para ma-provide ni government, okay, or for example, ni government or the resource provider yung mga resources to the third persons. Ipapadaan niya sa mga NPOs or sa mga non-profit organizations. The agency funds are, of course, recognized as liabilities. Ayan. Okay, so basically, that is the gist of what is a not-for-profit organization. Okay. The financial statements being furnished by NPOs and yung mga net asset classifications and reclassifications and yung mga major transactions ng NPO. So, the next video will follow with regards to the accounting for private colleges and universities. Peace.